Welcome, I'm Gretchen Cook, Policy Analyst with the Oregon State Board of Nursing. In this video, I'll speak about the role of Nurse Practice Acts in public protection, provide an overview of Oregon's Nurse Practice Act, and speak to responsibilities, permissions, and accountability that comes with RN and LPN license ownership in the state of Oregon. This will likely be a review for most Oregon licensed nurses. If, however, you find the content drifts beyond review, please utilize the links provided below to directly access and read the statutes and rules cited, as well as the other supplementary information provided. And as always, all statements communicated in this video shall not be construed as an official policy, position, opinion, or statement of the Oregon State Board of Nursing. OSBN staff cannot and do not provide legal advice. So let's dive right in. In the simplest of terms, a Nurse Practice Act is a set of laws written for the protection of people who receive nursing services. NPA laws are written and enacted by the governmental body of a country, a province, or a state for the protection of their own citizens and anyone else who happens to be physically located within its jurisdictional boundaries. In the United States, Nurse Practice Acts are written and enacted by the Legislative Assembly of each state, district, commonwealth, and U.S. territory. Once an NPA is enacted, implementation and enforcement of the Act will be delegated by the governing body to the state's Nursing Regulatory Authority, known as a Nursing Regulatory Body, or NRB. The laws of a Practice Act typically establish the formation, duties, powers, and authorities of the Nursing Regulatory Body, establish license types, title protections, requirements for licensure, and grounds for disciplinary actions. A license issued by a nursing regulatory body is authorization to the license recipient to engage in the practice of nursing with people physically located within the NRB's jurisdiction. And this is why the location of the client, meaning the recipient of nursing services, at the time of their interaction with the nurse determines which NRB holds jurisdictional authority over the practice of nursing. The implementation and enforcement of Oregon's NPA has been delegated by Oregon's Legislative Assembly to the Oregon State Board of Nursing. The OSBN, sometimes referred to as the board, is a 9-member nursing regulatory body appointed by the governor. The board is comprised of 9 people, which consists of 2 public members, 1 certified nursing assistant, 1 licensed practical nurse, and 5 RNs, to include 1 nurse practitioner, 1 nurse educator, 1 nurse administrator, and 2 direct care RNs in non-supervisory practice roles. The board members serve 3-year terms, can be reappointed for a 2nd term, and function under the executive branch of Oregon state government. The board meets regularly throughout the year, holding 6 2-day in-person meetings. These 2-day meetings include both executive and public sessions. Executive sessions are closed to the public, as this is where the board discusses disciplinary cases. Public sessions are open to all, and it is in public session where the board discusses and votes on operations and proposed rule changes, and votes on disciplinary cases by case number identifiers only. The 9-member board is supported by an agency staffed with approximately 65 executive branch state employees who assist the board as it fulfills its mission to protect the public through regulatory excellence and promoting the wellness of nursing professionals. Board agency staff are spread across several departments: the Director's Office, Licensing, Operations, Investigations, Communications, and Policy, which all work collaboratively to support the board in carrying out its multiple public safety responsibilities mandated by law. Those mandated laws, with few exceptions, are the Chapter 678 Oregon Revised Statutes, which are the foundation of Oregon's Nurse Practice Act. The NPA statutes, as all good statutes do, begin with a list of definitions of key terms. And I mention this now as I'll soon be sharing 2 of those statutory definitions, as they respectively underpin scope in the practice of nursing granted with RN licensure and with LPN licensure. So what else do the NPA statutes do? Well, they establish the formation and composition of the 9-member board, as well as identify specific duties, powers, and authorities the board must carry out. These board responsibilities include the approval of nursing education programs leading to licensure, issuing licenses and certificates to duly qualified applicants, establishing scope for the different license types issued, acting upon complaints received, and taking disciplinary action against a license when the board finds the license owner has violated the requirements of the Act. The final example of OSBN responsibilities is the authority to write Oregon administrative rules, which serve to operationalize the requirements of statute. In addition to board responsibility, Chapter 678 statutes also establish specific responsibilities and permissions of those to whom a license has been issued. Before we dive into those nurse responsibilities and permissions, a little bit about the Chapter 851 Oregon Administrative Rules, which complete the body of law recognized as Oregon's Nurse Practice Act. The Chapter 851 Oregon Administrative Rules, sometimes referred to as OARs or ORs, are the administrative corollary to the Chapter 678 statutes and carry the force of law in the state of Oregon. It is through the Chapter 851 OARs that Oregon's nursing regulatory body, the Oregon State Board of Nursing, operationalizes the duties, powers, and authorities granted by statute. The Nurse Practice Act's OARs are divided into 16 separate divisions, which are organized and named according to their content. So for example, Division 6 contains definitions, and these are terms that are used throughout the other Chapter 851 divisions. Division 31 contains licensure requirements for nurses, LPN, RN, nurse emeritus, and advanced practice registered nursing types, the nurse practitioner, clinical nurse specialist, and certified registered nurse anesthetist. Division 62 contains standards for the certification of nursing assistants and medication aides. And the division from which a good portion of this video's content comes, Division 45, which establishes scope in the practice of nursing with RN and LPN licensure and minimum standards or statements of actions and behavior expected of all nurses in any Oregon setting and role. I'll return to Division 45 shortly, but first, some specific OSBN licensee owner responsibilities based purely on statute. So we'll start with the Practice Act's ORS 678-135 duty to report violation statutes. This statute requires the OSBN license owner to report any suspected violation of the Practice Act, inclusive of the NPA statutes and rules, by oneself, by another nurse, a certified nursing assistant, or a certified medication aide, to the Oregon State Board of Nursing. And where to report? The board has a dedicated landing page for filing complaints, and that page includes information on how to file and what to include when you file. This same statute requires the OSBN license owner who has reasonable cause to believe that a licensee of another board has engaged in prohibited conduct to report the conduct to the other board in a manner consistent with ORS 676-150. This is a non-NPA statute, which I'm going to cover in the next slide. I will point out that these reporting responsibilities reflected on this slide both begin with a disclaimer indicating that reporting must occur unless such reporting is prohibited for disclosure by state or federal laws relating to confidentiality or the protection of health information. And before you ask, no, OSBN does not keep a repository of state and federal laws related to confidentiality or the protection of health information, as those do not fall under the jurisdictional authority of the board. The board's authority is over the individual license and the individual license owner who is responsible for knowing and adhering to those laws. This brings us to the Chapter 676-150 statute cited in the NPA's duty to report statute. This statute is located outside the NPA for good reason, and that is because it applies to the licensees of 24 different licensing boards. For example, of course, the Board of Nursing, but also Oregon Medical Board, Dental Board, Social Work Board, Veterinary Medical Examining Board, and even the Mortuary and Cemetery Board. The point here is that the licensee of any of the identified boards who has reasonable cause to believe that a licensee of any of the 24 boards has engaged in prohibited conduct or unprofessional conduct must report the conduct to the board responsible for that licensee and do so no later than 10 working days after learning of the conduct. I will note here that while making a formal complaint of oneself or of another nurse to the board, or make a report of a licensee of another board to their board, it's not an easy action for some nurses. However, it is an action required by law and necessary for the protection of those who receive nursing and other health-related services in the state of Oregon. it will behoove you to access the Chapter 676-150 statute directly, not only to refresh your knowledge of the 24 specific boards currently identified, but also to learn the statute-specific definitions of the terms prohibited conduct, unprofessional conduct, conduct the OSBN license owner is responsible for both recognizing and reporting. Chapter 676 statutes establish additional reporting responsibilities of those licensed by the 24 identified boards. A licensee of any of the 24 boards who is convicted of a misdemeanor or felony crime, or who is arrested for a felony crime, must report their conviction or arrest to their licensing board within 10 days after the conviction or arrest. The statute also establishes that a licensee who fails to report prohibited conduct, fails to report unprofessional conduct, or fails to report their own misdemeanor or felony conviction or felony arrest is also subject to discipline by their licensing board. And this brings us to the last statute-related content on reporting responsibilities. The examples I've chosen to present on this slide, and they're just examples, run the time and space gamut from applicability in specific settings and specific situations to applicability 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I will add here that as board staff, I hold no authority to interpret any of these statutes for you. They are identified here as a courtesy, and all are retrievable from the Oregon State Legislature webpage, link provided below. Reporting responsibilities specific to settings and situations include more Chapter 676 statutes. And this is for the healthcare provider providing emergency care in a healthcare facility. The statute identifies reporting to law enforcement of a person believed to be under the influence of intoxicants and about to drive a motor vehicle. A Chapter 146 statute establishes the responsibility of a specific list of healthcare providers, RN included, to report to law enforcement when they have reasonable cause to believe that a person brought before them for examination, care, or treatment has had injury inflicted other than by accidental means. The other examples listed identify the duty of officials to report, officials, which is defined in those statutes to include nurses, to report suspected child abuse, the suspected abuse of adults with mental illness, suspected abuse of persons with developmental and intellectual disabilities, and the suspected abuse of long-term care residents. Now, for each of these respective statutes identified, the statute will specify how and where reports are to be made. Two final notes on reporting responsibilities for the OSBN license owner. So first, it's important to remember that unless otherwise specified in a statute, reporting responsibilities apply to all OSBN license owners and continue to apply even after a nurse is told, hey, don't worry about it, I'll make a report for you. Or maybe a nurse is directed, advised, or told not to make a report. The responsibility rests with the individual OSBN license owner to make that report. Second, the protection of people who receive nursing services, the protection of vulnerable populations, and the well-being of the broader public is strengthened by nurses fulfilling reporting responsibilities that come with license ownership. So returning to the Chapter 678 statutes, let's look at permissions granted with license ownership. And the next two slides are going to involve the statutory definitions I referenced earlier. So first up, permissions granted with RN licensure. Receipt of an OSBN issued RN license is express permission from the state of Oregon to engage in the practice of registered nursing with clients who are physically located in this state. For the purposes of public protection, the term practice of registered nursing is defined in Chapter 678 statutes and means the application of knowledge drawn from a broad, in-depth education in the social and physical sciences in assessing, planning, ordering, giving, delegating, teaching, and supervising care that promotes a person's optimum health and independence. This is what the RN license owner is expressly permitted to do upon receipt of their RN license. Let's check out LPN permissions. Receipt of an OSBN issued LPN license is express permission from the state of Oregon to engage in the practice of practical nursing with clients who are physically located in Oregon. The Chapter 678 statutes define the practice of practical nursing to mean the application of knowledge drawn from a basic education in the social and physical sciences, in planning and giving nursing care, and in assisting persons toward achieving health and well-being. This is what LPN license owner is expressly authorized to do with persons and clients, recipients of nursing services who are located within Oregon's borders. I'll now turn to the Chapter 851 Oregon Administrative Rules, and specifically Division 45, because this is where the board establishes scope in the practice of nursing for these two license types, and then operationalizes what that practice of nursing looks like, and identifies specific actions and behaviors expected of all nurses in any Oregon setting and role. The first step again, RN licensure and RN licensure permissions and responsibilities. So Division 45, Rule number 0060, establishes the RN's practice of registered nursing is independent. And you heard that right. And just to send that point home, there are no NPA requirements, either in statute or rule, that require an RN's practice of registered nursing to be supervised by anyone. It's the RN's own independent application of knowledge. And if you're thinking, hey, wait a minute, I have a supervisor where I work. Well, likely you do, but know that that is a requirement of your practice setting, of your employer, and it is not a legal requirement of Oregon's Practice Act. Division 45 then operationalizes the definition of practice of registered nursing as identified in statute by identifying the actions through which the practice of registered nursing occurs. So if you have eyes on your screen right now, you're likely recognizing the listed actions as the interconnected components of the critical thinking model known as nursing process. Assessment, in RN noticing, observing, evaluating, determining the importance of specific data related to their client's current state of health that brought them into contact with the RN. Based on assessment, arriving at a reasoned conclusion, diagnostic statement, clinical judgment regarding the client's response to their current state of health. And based on assessment and judgment, the identification of expected outcomes and development of a plan of care with interventions and strategies designed to assist the client in meeting the expected outcomes. Implementation of the plan while evaluating client progress toward expected outcomes and response to planned interventions. This is the practice of registered nursing as operationalized by the 9-member governor-appointed Oregon State Board of Nursing and applies regardless of one's Oregon practice environment or practice role. So just consider this. The faith community RN, whose client or recipient of their nursing services is their congregation. The RN in the ICU, whose client is a critically ill patient. The RN chief nursing officer, let's just say, of the organization where the ICU nurse works, whose client is their organization's nursing workforce. One size fits all, Division 45 scope in the practice of registered nursing standards. Also guessing here that you've noticed these actions mirror the framework for American Nursing Association's scope and standards of practice. They do, as both describe nursing practice as demonstrated by the nursing process. The difference is that ANA's scope and standards of practice are professional standards, meaning they're authoritative statements of actions and behaviors written by the profession for the profession, by nurses for nurses, that all RNs, regardless of role, specialty, setting, and geographic location of practice, are expected to competently perform. Oregon's Nurse Practice Act Division 45 standards, on the other hand, are legal standards, meaning they identify minimum expected actions and behaviors of the RN as adopted by the Oregon State Board of Nursing for the purpose of protecting those who receive RN services in the state of Oregon. Division 45 is also where the board establishes scope in the practice of practical nursing and the minimum expected actions and behaviors of all LPNs in an Oregon setting and role. LPN licensure grants a clinically directed practice of nursing. So this means the practice of practical nursing is permitted to occur only at the clinical direction of an RN's plan of care or at the clinical direction of a healthcare provider's treatment plan. And if you're unsure about who all the healthcare provider definition covers, please access Division 6 because it's a long list of providers. So let's put this operational standards to practice here. And so let's say we have an RN who's engaged in their own practice of registered nursing. They've generated a plan of care for their client and has assigned performance of the plan of care interventions to an LPN. So enter the LPN. An LPN accepts the assignment. Now, at the time of the LPN's interaction with the client, the LPN conducts a focused assessment. This means that within the parameters or as focused by the RN's plan of care, the LPN collects, validates, and analyzes client data for the purpose of identifying the client's priority condition at the time of their interaction. Based on their focused assessment, the LPN generates a focused plan of care. So focused plan of care, what this means, it is the LPN's prioritization of interventions from the RN's plan of care to be carried out with the client. The LPN implements their focused plan of care interventions, evaluates the client's response to interventions, client progress toward the RN plan of care identified expected outcomes, and communicates client status and any issues or concerns with the RN per their context of care. So this is the practice of practical nursing as described in Division 45 and applicable to all LPNs in any Oregon setting and practice role. Now, before I move on to additional license owner responsibilities, I want to be sure everybody understands a term I just used, and that term is context of care. Division 6 of the Practice Act defines context of care to mean the environment where a nurse's practice of nursing occurs. The definition further identifies that an individual nurse's context of care will be defined by factors including, but not limited to, the location where the nurse's client receives nursing services, any laws, regulations, or credentialing standards applicable to that location. The individual nurse's practice role could be position description, professional service contract, that which identifies the types of nursing services to be provided in that context of care. Policies and procedures that support activities and interventions carried out by the nurse in their practice role. Professional specialty nursing and other professional standards applicable to the nurse's role. And ultimately, the ability of the nurse's client to self-direct the nursing strategies or interventions to which they've given their consent. Now, this term is used, I believe, 15 times in Division 45 standards, and its use is to qualify that qualify the expected or the identified action or behavior within a standard, and to qualify that it must occur or be carried out in a manner consistent with or as established by the nurse's practice environment. I just want you to hold that thought for a moment. This brings us to Division 45 Standards of Practice. So the standards of practice consist of roughly 80 statements of minimum expected actions and behaviors, more responsibilities of RN license ownership. And these statements are organized under 10 section numbers. Now, important here is that these standards run parallel or at the same time as the Division 45 scope and the practice of nursing standards. So in other words, while engaging in the practice of nursing, at scope authorized for one's license type, a nurse's actions and behaviors will meet these minimum expected actions, behaviors, and conduct. I'll add here that the Division 45 standards of practice are comparable with ANA's standards of professional performance, which describe a competent level of behavior in the professional role. But as we've learned, Division 45 standards are public protection or legal standards and serve as a benchmark for the 9-member board to evaluate a nurse's actions and behaviors to determine whether a violation of Oregon's Nurse Practice Act has occurred. And I will just take the liberty here to add that the prudent OSBN license owner will use both professional standards and legal standards as benchmarks to practice self-evaluation as well as for peer review processes. So here are a handful of the 80+ Division 45 legal standards of practice. And what you see here, or these abridged statements, are pretty much verbatim for what is printed, what is codified in Division 45 itself. Now, the first two I provided are from standards related to a nurse's responsibility for self-regulation in the practice of nursing. Here we see that the board has established the responsibility of the nurse in any Oregon setting and role to practice consistent with their context of care and consistent with current and evolving nursing and other sciences. Standards related to documentation. So here we see licensee responsibilities related that apply in any Oregon setting and role, and this means from the bedside to the boardroom, to document the practice of nursing in a timely, accurate, thorough, and clear manner, and consistent with their context of care. The fourth standards example here establishes that the individual nurse must only accept an assignment that is within their individual scope of practice. Now, for those not familiar with the term individual scope of practice, it's defined in Division 6, and it means a nurse's known set of activities, interventions, and roles occurring within their practice of nursing for which they possess the competencies necessary to perform safely in their context of care. And we'll have additional content on individual scope of practice in a separate video. The last example on this slide is the responsibility of the individual nurse to accept accountability for one's own decisions and actions. And this is an important one. Sometimes nurses get between a rock and a hard spot and people are telling them to do X, Y, and Z, and that's fine. But the nurse needs to know that they are accountable for their own decisions and actions, regardless of who told whom to do what. And I will add here that this last example on a individual nurse's acceptance of accountability is so foundational to client safety and to public protection. And the reason for this is that accountability in one's own actions, accountability is a higher level activity from responsibility alone, whereas the accountable nurse is going to examine each presenting situation, explore the various options available, demonstrate a knowledgeable understanding of the possible consequences of options explored or considered, and then arrive at a clinical judgment for an action which can be justified from their knowledge base. Accountability with licensure. The practice of nursing is the application of knowledge. This brings us to the final Division 45 standards for discussion, which are the conduct derogatory standards. These standards do not articulate permissions or responsibilities, so I won't be providing examples. However, they do identify a not all-inclusive list of over 100 statements of actions and behaviors or conduct the board has determined to either adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the public, fails to conform to Division 45 scope and standards of practice, or that fails to conform with the accepted standards of the nursing profession. And for perspective purposes, I will add that these are the standards cited in board orders of disciplinary action. For the OSBN license owner, they provide a different kind of benchmark, if you will, against which one's own conduct and the conduct of other licensees may be appraised. This concludes the overview of Oregon's Nurse Practice Act and the responsibilities, permissions, and accountability that come with RN and LPN license ownership in the state of Oregon. I thank you for your time and encourage you to access the links and resources provided below. And the best to you in your practice.